They treated me like nothing when I was a kid, and for a long time I thought that was just what family felt like. There were no bruises anyone could photograph. No dramatic screaming matches that would make outsiders step in. No single story I could tell that would instantly make people understand. That is what made it so hard to name. It was death by smallness. I learned early that my feelings were interruptions. My needs were inconveniences. And my presence only mattered when I was useful. In that house, attention was something that moved around me, never toward me. If I did well, it was expected. If I struggled, it was my problem. If I was quiet, no one asked why. If I disappeared into my room for hours, that was easier for everyone. I was not the child they worried about, celebrated, or protected. I was the child they relied on without ever acknowledging that reliance had replaced love. I helped with chores before being asked, learned to read the room before speaking, and became the kind of kid adults describe as easy when what they really mean is trained not to need anything. Looking back, I can see how unnatural it was. How much of my personality was built around taking up as little space as possible. But when you are growing up inside that kind of emotional neglect, you do not call it neglect. You call it normal. You call it family. You call it being mature for your age. You call it learning how to survive. And survival became my talent. I knew exactly how to be agreeable, how to anticipate moods, how to make myself useful enough to avoid being resented and small enough to avoid being noticed too much. That was the balance I lived inside. Not loved, not hated, just tolerated as long as I made life easier for everybody else. The worst part was never one cruel sentence or one ugly moment. It was the accumulation of everything that never happened. No one asked what I wanted. No one checked why I had stopped mentioning school projects, friendships, dreams, or fears. No one saw the way I learned to swallow disappointment before it reached my face. Birthdays were obligations. Achievements were acknowledgments, not celebrations. Pain was met with practicality, not comfort. I learned not to cry in front of them because tears made them irritated. And I learned not to ask for help because help came with a debt attached. If I was sick, I was inconvenient. If I succeeded, I was lucky. If I failed, I was careless. There was no version of me that seemed to deserve gentleness. I used to watch other kids talk to their parents with a kind of unthinking openness that felt almost reckless to me. They expected sympathy. They expected interest. They expected to matter. I could not imagine what that felt like. I had already internalized a different rule. Speak only when necessary. Ask only when absolutely required. And never assume your feelings will be received kindly. That rule followed me everywhere. It shaped how I talked to teachers, how I acted with friends, how I entered every relationship in my adult life. I apologized too quickly. I accepted too little. I worked too hard to earn basic consideration. And beneath all of that was a belief so old I barely noticed it. I was easier to keep around than to love. That belief did not appear out of nowhere. It was built, day after day, by being treated like background furniture in my own childhood. Useful when needed, ignored when not. The pain of that kind of upbringing is strange because it leaves you starving for something you cannot describe. You know something is missing, but you do not have the language for it until much later. By then, the emptiness has often become your personality. If you grew up feeling invisible in your own family, would you keep trying to earn their love or start building a life where you don't need it? Comment your choice. I did not leave home in one dramatic act of rebellion. I drifted away the way I had learned to do everything else quietly, with as little disruption as possible. I found work, saved what I could, moved out, and told myself I was just doing what adults do. I did not frame it as escape because that word felt too intense, too accusing, too honest. But once I was gone, the silence from them told the truth for me. No one called to ask if I was settling in. No one checked whether I was lonely, scared, or struggling. There was no emotional fallout because, for them, Nothing had changed except the location of a person who had never been the center of their concern. That realization hurt more than I expected. Some part of me had still believed absence might create value. That maybe not being there would finally show them I had mattered after all. It did not. If anything, my leaving made my role clearer. I had not been missed. I had simply been replaced by other routines. For a while, that hollowed me out. I kept waiting for the moment when anger would save me. But anger never came cleanly. What came instead was exhaustion. For the first time, there was no one around to tell me what my emotions should look like. I could come home and be quiet without it being read as disrespect. I could spend money without justifying every purchase. I could sit with my own thoughts long enough to realize how little of my life had actually belonged to me. The early years were not glamorous. I made mistakes with money, with work, with trust. I overextended myself because being useful still felt safer than being known. I said yes when I meant no. I let people lean on me harder than they should have. But slowly, painfully, I started noticing something new. My life changed when I changed it. That sounds obvious now, but it was revolutionary to someone raised to believe their needs never altered the room. I chose jobs, apartments, friends, routines, boundaries, tiny decisions at first, then larger ones. And each decision built a person I had never been allowed to become as a child. Not extraordinary, not perfect, just present in my own life. Success came gradually, which I think is why it felt real. There was no fairy tale moment where everything turned around overnight. I worked jobs that barely covered rent before I found one that gave me stability. I learned skills because no one else was going to rescue me. I pushed through the kind of loneliness that makes your own thoughts feel louder than traffic. And somewhere inside all of that, I stopped trying to become someone worthy of being loved by my family and started becoming someone I could actually live with. That shift changed everything. Once I stopped measuring myself through the lens they had given me, I started building differently. I took opportunities they would have mocked. I trusted instincts they had trained me to doubt. I kept going even when no one clapped, because I was no longer performing for approval. Over time, life became solid. Not easy, but solid. I had work I was proud of. I had people around me who noticed when I was tired and asked why. I had routines that were mine, a home that felt safe, and a sense of self that no longer dissolved the moment someone else disapproved of me. That was when they started noticing me again. Not when I was struggling, not when I was building from nothing, not when I needed care. They noticed when there was finally something visible to notice: stability, progress, maybe even success in the narrow ways they respected. The first message was almost insulting in how normal it sounded. Casual, friendly, as if years of absence had been a scheduling issue instead of a pattern. Then came the update requests. The questions about my job, my life, where I lived, how I had been, and beneath all of it was that unmistakable shift I knew from childhood. Interest sharpened by need. They did not miss me. They had discovered I had become useful in a new way. The request came soon after, though they dressed it up before getting there. That was always their style. Warm up the room. Create the illusion of reconnection. Then move toward the actual reason for contact, as if it had naturally risen out of care. A family emergency. Financial strain. A logistical mess. A need for time. Money. Support. Resources. Access, some combination of all of it. As they spoke, I felt something in me go very still. Not shocked. Not even angry. Just clear. Suddenly, I could see the entire architecture of our relationship at once. The way every piece fit together with terrible logic. I mattered when I could solve something. I mattered when I could absorb pressure. Contribute labor. Calm conflict. Provide money. Make space. Fix damage. I had spent my childhood mistaking that usefulness for a kind of conditional love because I did not know there was any other kind. But now, hearing them reach for me after years of indifference, I finally understood the difference between being needed and being valued. Needed is transactional. Needed appears when there is a problem to transfer. Needed disappears when the crisis passes. Valued stays. Valued notices. Valued remembers your humanity before it remembers your utility. They had never valued me. They had managed me, used me, overlooked me, then returned when my life finally contained something they could benefit from. That realization should have shattered me. Instead, it felt like the cleanest truth I had ever heard. For the first time, their behavior no longer confused me, because I was no longer asking it to become love. I did not owe my younger self another reenactment of the same wound. I did not owe them access just because they finally learned to speak to me politely. Their need was not redemption. It was repetition. The only difference was that this time I could see it happening in real time. I did not go back. I did not say yes out of guilt. Nostalgia. Or the old reflex that told me my worth lived in how useful I could be. I took longer to answer than they expected. And in that space, I listened carefully to what my own mind and body were doing. There was grief. Yes. But under the grief was relief. That mattered. It told me the child in me was still waiting to be chosen. But the adult in me already knew the cost of waiting. When I answered, I was respectful and closed. I did not explain my entire history to people who had lived it with me and chosen not to see it. I simply refused the role they had written for me. That refusal felt larger than the message itself. It reached backward through time and touched every version of me that had stayed silent to keep peace. It reached the child who learned not to need. The teenager who disappeared into usefulness. The young adult who kept hoping absence might finally make someone notice. I noticed. That became enough. They treated me like nothing as a kid. Now they need me. Those two truths belong together because one explains the other. People who are accustomed to your silence often experience your boundaries as cruelty. People who only knew your usefulness often call your refusal selfish. I expected that. What I did not expect was how light I would feel once I stopped negotiating with their version of me. Need does not create entitlement. Need does not erase history. Need does not transform neglect into family. I spent enough of my life being available to people who never truly saw me. I am not doing it again. The child they ignored grew into someone they cannot summon on demand. And that may be the closest thing to justice I will ever get. So be honest when family only comes back because they need something. Do you help them or walk away for good? Drop your answer below. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.